It was a chilly evening in New York City. The small, family-owned diner on the corner of Maple Street buzzed with its usual crowd. Students from the nearby university, a couple of older regulars sipping coffee as they read the paper, and the occasional passerby who stumbled in to escape the biting cold. Jessica had been waitressing there for 3 years now. She loved the warmth of the place, the comfort of its checkered tablecloths, and the hum of laughter and clinking dishes that always seemed to fill the air. Tonight, however, felt different. As she tied her apron and stepped onto the floor, Jessica noticed a tall young man entering the diner. He moved with a quiet confidence that didn't immediately draw attention, but there was something striking about him. He slid into a booth near the window, his sharp profile illuminated by the glow of the neon sign outside. Jessica grabbed her notepad, plastered on her usual cheerful smile, and approached the booth. "Good evening. What can I get started for you?" she asked, her voice warm but professional. The young man looked up and smiled faintly. His face was familiar, though Jessica couldn't quite place it. He had an air of politeness, his words measured and deliberate. "Just a coffee to start, please, and maybe, what would you recommend?" Jessica rattled off a few popular options, and he settled on the classic cheeseburger and fries. As she walked back to the kitchen, she tried to shake off the nagging sense that she'd seen him somewhere before. Maybe he was one of those up-and-coming models she'd seen in magazines lying around the diner. She shrugged it off. After all, it wasn't her job to dwell on customers' lives, just to serve them. The diner continued its usual rhythm, and Jessica found herself stealing glances at the mysterious young man. He seemed reserved, almost lost in thought, occasionally glancing out the window at the snowflakes beginning to fall. When his order was ready, Jessica delivered it with a smile. "Here you go. Enjoy." "Thank you," he replied softly, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. There was a kindness in his gaze, but also a weight, as if he carried something unspoken. Jessica didn't linger. She had other tables to tend to, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to thin. The young man stayed at his booth, sipping his coffee long after his plate was cleared. Jessica checked on him once or twice, but he assured her he was fine, tipping generously each time she refilled his cup. Finally, just as the clock struck 10 and the diner's atmosphere began to quiet down, he signaled for the check. Jessica brought it over, and he pulled out a sleek wallet. As he placed a crisp bill inside the check folder, he paused, seemingly contemplating something. Then, with a pen he pulled from his coat pocket, he wrote a note on the receipt. He stood, nodded politely at Jessica, and walked out into the night without another word. Curiosity got the better of her, and Jessica hurried to pick up the check folder. Her hands trembled as she read the note. The words were simple but left her breathless. Jessica's eyes lingered on the note, her heart racing as she read the words again, just to be sure she wasn't imagining things. "Thank you for your kindness. You never know whose day you might brighten. Barron Trump." Her breath hitched in her throat. Barron Trump? She glanced up instinctively, as if he might still be near the entrance. But the young man had disappeared into the snow-dusted streets, his tall frame swallowed by the city's cold embrace. Jessica sank into the booth he had just occupied, holding the receipt delicately between her fingers. A sudden wave of disbelief washed over her. She knew who Barron Trump was, of course, the son of a former president, someone whose life had always seemed distant, locked behind the walls of politics and privilege. Yet, there he had been, quietly sitting in the corner booth of this small diner, exchanging simple pleasantries like any regular customer. The note wasn't extravagant. There were no promises of life-changing sums or flowery words. But it wasn't about that. It was the sentiment, the weight of recognition that her small acts of service had somehow resonated with him. Jessica felt her throat tighten, a lump of emotion forming that she struggled to swallow. Her manager, Charlie, shuffled out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hey Jess, everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jessica quickly slid the receipt into her apron pocket, shaking her head with a soft laugh. "I'm fine, Charlie. Just one of those nights." Charlie squinted at her, clearly not convinced, but unwilling to press further. "All right then, cash out when you're ready." Jessica nodded and stood, heading behind the counter to settle the bill. As she counted the cash, her mind kept drifting back to the note. Why had Barron Trump chosen this diner, out of all the places in New York? Had he simply been passing by, or was there something more to it? The questions buzzed in her head, but there were no clear answers. Later that evening, when the diner had fully emptied and the chairs were flipped onto the tables, Jessica pulled the note out once more. The diner's soft lighting cast a warm glow over the words, making them feel even more personal. You never know whose day you might brighten. The simplicity of the message struck her deeply. Jessica often wondered if her job made any real difference. She'd listen to customers vent about their lives, offer them warm smiles, and lend a sympathetic ear, but it all felt routine. Yet somehow, without realizing it, she had left an impression on someone she'd never have expected. The next morning, Jessica woke up early despite having worked late. She couldn't shake the thought of the night before, and it lingered as she brewed her coffee and stared out her apartment window at the snow-covered streets below. Part of her wanted to share the experience, tell someone, anyone, but another part of her hesitated. Would people even believe her? Or would it come off as some far-fetched story? She finally settled on telling her best friend, Rachel, who worked at a nearby boutique. They met for coffee after Rachel's shift, and Jessica pulled out the note, sliding it across the table. Rachel's eyes widened as she read it, her mouth dropping open slightly. No way. Barron Trump. Here. In your diner? Jessica laughed softly. I swear, I almost didn't believe it myself. Rachel leaned in closer, lowering her voice. Okay, but what was he like? Did he seem, I don't know, normal? Jessica thought for a moment, trying to recall every detail. Yeah, honestly, he was polite. Quiet, but not in a standoffish way. Just calm, I guess. And he tipped really well. Rachel grinned. I guess the rich do have manners sometimes. They both laughed, but Jessica's thoughts returned to the note. The encounter felt too significant to dismiss as a chance meeting. That evening, as she clocked in for her next shift, Jessica tucked the note carefully into her locker. It felt almost like a charm, a reminder that even in the quietest corners of life, the unexpected could happen. She didn't expect to see him again, but the thought crossed her mind each time the diner bell chimed and the door swung open. And while the days passed and new customers came and went, Jessica held onto that simple message, letting it remind her that sometimes kindness left ripples long after the moment had passed. But life had a way of surprising her. 2 weeks later, on another snowy evening, the diner door opened, and Jessica glanced up from behind the counter. Her heart skipped. It was him. Barron Trump stepped inside once more, shaking snow off his coat as his gaze scanned the room. When his eyes met hers, he smiled faintly and nodded, heading to the same booth by the window. Jessica grabbed a menu, smoothing the front of her apron as she walked over, back for the cheeseburger and fries. Barron smiled, the same quiet kindness in his expression. Yeah, and maybe a coffee too. As she jotted down the order, Jessica felt the tension of curiosity brewing. Tonight, she'd find the courage to ask why he had chosen this little diner. As Jessica poured Barron Trump's coffee, her hands were steady, but her mind raced. This wasn't just another customer. This was someone who, despite his background, had chosen to return to her diner. Twice, she placed the cup down gently, the rich aroma wafting between them. Here you go, she said with a smile, tucking her notepad back into her apron. Barron looked up from his phone, offering a nod of gratitude. Thank you. Jessica lingered for a second longer than usual, her curiosity bubbling to the surface. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. Can I ask you something? She said quietly, hoping not to come off as intrusive. Barron raised his brow, setting his phone aside. Of course. Jessica shifted her weight, glancing out the diner's large window where snowflakes danced under the streetlights. I mean, I know who you are. But I guess I just wonder, why here? Why this diner? For a moment, Barron didn't answer. His eyes flickered to the window, watching the snowfall. The silence stretched long enough that Jessica began to second-guess her question. But then he spoke. My mom used to bring me to places like this when I was a kid, Barron said, his voice soft and thoughtful. Small diners, places that felt real, away from the cameras and attention. It felt normal. I guess sometimes I miss that. Jessica felt her chest tighten. There was something disarmingly honest about his words. I figured no one would pay much attention to me here. Barron continued, glancing around at the diner's cozy, unassuming interior. And I wasn't wrong. Jessica chuckled softly. Yeah, we're not exactly midtown, but I think that's part of the charm. Barron smiled, nodding. It is. The conversation could have ended there, but Jessica felt the need to add something. For what it's worth, I don't think anyone's really looking to bother you here. Most people just want a warm meal and a quiet evening. Barron's gaze met hers, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. I noticed, and I appreciate it. Jessica nodded, tucking her hands into her apron pockets. Well, let me know if you need anything else. As she walked back to the counter, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls between them had thinned just a little. Barron Trump wasn't just a name she'd heard on TV. He was someone who, in his own way, was seeking a sense of normalcy. The rest of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. Barron lingered over his meal, sipping his coffee slowly, as if he wasn't in any rush to leave. Jessica checked on him every now and then, but they exchanged fewer words. There was a quiet understanding between them, and somehow that felt enough. When Barron finally asked for the check, Jessica brought it over, and just like before, he took his time writing something at the bottom. She resisted the urge to peek immediately. As he stood, he pulled on his coat and paused near the door. Thank you, Jessica, he said softly. Her name on his lips felt oddly personal, and she smiled. Anytime. Stay warm out there. He gave a small wave and stepped out into the snowy night. Jessica finally flipped open the check folder as soon as he left. This time, his note was a little longer. Sometimes the simplest things remind us of what really matters. Thank you for making this feel like home. Barron. Jessica stared at the words, blinking back the sudden emotion swelling in her chest. She didn't know why it hit her so hard, but it did. She tucked the note carefully into her pocket, holding it like a keepsake. In the weeks that followed, Barron returned to the diner on occasion. Never too frequently, but just enough that Jessica began to expect him. They never spoke of politics, fame, or his family. The conversation stayed light. The weather, books, random thoughts, simple things that grounded them in normalcy. And in those quiet moments, Jessica realized something. It wasn't about who he was or his background. It was about connection, about being human in a world that so often demanded distance. One evening, as the last customer left and Jessica locked the front door, she glanced at the notes Barron had left over time, each one carefully tucked inside her locker. They weren't grand gestures, but they meant something. She smiled to herself, feeling grateful for the small, unexpected friendships life sometimes offered. And just as she turned off the lights and stepped into the crisp night air, she thought, perhaps it was those simple, fleeting moments that held the most weight. The winter breeze tugged at Jessica's scarf as she stepped out into the cold, her breath forming soft clouds in the air. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional car humming by. She pulled her coat tighter around her and started her walk home. But her mind lingered on the notes Barron had left. There was something about them that felt like a puzzle piece falling into place, though she couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the simplicity of his words, the quiet acknowledgement that even in the most ordinary of places, connection could happen. Or maybe it was the way he carried himself, gentle, polite, yet unmistakably distant, as if part of him was still guarded. Over the next few weeks, Barron continued to visit. Sometimes he'd show up late in the evening, after the dinner rush had died down. Other times, he'd quietly slip in during slower afternoons. Jessica began to recognize the subtle ways he avoided attention. Always choosing the corner booth, always wearing a plain coat that blended in with the crowd. But each time, without fail, he left behind a note. The collection grew slowly, tucked away in her locker like small treasures. Some notes were brief, just a few words of gratitude or a kind remark about the food. Others were more reflective, hinting at memories from his childhood or thoughts on the simple joy of finding a quiet space in the chaos of the world. Jessica never pressed him for more. She liked the rhythm they'd fallen into. One evening, just as the first signs of spring began to thaw the city, Barron arrived as the diner was nearing closing time. The place was empty except for an older couple in the back, chatting softly over slices of pie. Jessica approached his table, notebook in hand. "Cheeseburger and fries?" she asked with a smile. Barron chuckled lightly. "You know me too well." She jotted down the order, but before she could turn away, Barron spoke again, his tone quieter. "Can I ask you something this time?" Jessica glanced at him curiously, tucking the pen behind her ear. "Sure." He hesitated for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Do you ever feel like you're just waiting for something? Like your life's on pause, and you're not sure when it's going to start moving again?" The question caught her off guard. Jessica thought for a moment, folding her arms as she leaned slightly against the table. "Yeah, I think everyone feels that way sometimes," she admitted. "I used to think I'd have everything figured out by now, but life doesn't really work that way." Barron nodded, as if her words confirmed something he'd been wrestling with. "I guess I thought things would be different," he said quietly. "After my dad left office, I thought there'd be more clarity. But it feels like everything just stopped. Like I'm waiting for whatever comes next, but I don't know what that is." Jessica's heart softened. She could see the weight he carried, not as the son of a public figure, but as a young man navigating the uncertainty of his future. "I think that's normal," she said gently. "But I also think that sometimes the waiting part is important. It's where you figure things out, even if it doesn't feel like it." Barron's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment the veil of distance between them lifted. "Thanks," he said softly, offering a small smile. Jessica smiled back. "Anytime." She walked away to place his order, but her mind stayed with the conversation. There was a depth to Barron that she hadn't expected, a quiet vulnerability that most people probably never saw. As she prepared his food, Jessica found herself hoping he'd find what he was looking for, even if it took time. When she brought the meal over, Barron thanked her as usual, but this time, there was no note left behind when he paid the bill. Instead, as he stood to leave, he simply said, "See you around, Jessica." And for the first time, she felt that he wasn't just passing through. He was becoming part of the diner's quiet, unspoken fabric, a familiar face in the ebb and flow of ordinary life. The days melted into weeks, and Barron's visits became less frequent as spring blossomed fully into summer. Jessica noticed the shift, but she wasn't surprised. People drifted in and out of the diner all the time, and even though Barron's presence had felt different, she knew better than to hold onto expectations. Still, each time the diner bell chimed, she found herself glancing toward the door, half expecting to see his tall frame appear through the entrance. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and the sky bled soft orange hues across the city, Jessica stood behind the counter drying glasses when a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "You know, I think I missed the snow." She turned, and there he was, Barron, standing just inside the doorway, his coat slung over one arm. Jessica grinned. "I can't say the same. I'll take warm weather over freezing any day." Barron chuckled as he slid into his usual booth. The sight felt oddly comforting, like the return of an old friend. Jessica grabbed a menu, though she already knew his order. "The usual?" He glanced up at her, something playful in his expression. "Actually, I think I'll mix things up. What's good today?" Jessica feigned shock, pressing a hand to her chest. "Who are you, and what have you done with Barron Trump?" He laughed softly. "I'm full of surprises." Jessica smirked. "All right, I'll get you the special. And a coffee?" "Always." As she walked to the kitchen to place the order, Jessica couldn't help but notice that Barron seemed lighter tonight. The weight she often saw in his eyes had lifted, even if just for a little while. When she returned with his food, they fell into easy conversation. It wasn't deep, just small talk about the city, summer plans, and random musings about life. But Jessica didn't mind. There was something comforting in the simplicity of it. As Barron ate, Jessica wiped down the counter, occasionally stealing glances his way. She wondered if this was the last time he'd come by before disappearing again. But then Barron surprised her. "I might not be around much for a while," he said, setting down his fork and leaning back against the booth. "I'm heading to Florida for a bit. Family stuff." Jessica nodded, trying to hide the twinge of disappointment she felt. Yeah, that makes sense. It's probably nice down there this time of year. Barron's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but he stayed quiet. As he reached for the check, Jessica spoke without thinking. You know you're always welcome here, right? Whenever you're back. He paused, his hand resting on the table, and a soft smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Thanks, Jess. That means a lot. Jessica nodded, and for once, he didn't leave a note, just a generous tip and the quiet understanding that this wasn't really goodbye. When the door closed behind him, Jessica stood for a long while, staring at the spot where he had sat. Maybe life really was just a series of fleeting moments, she thought. But some of them, no matter how brief, had a way of staying with you. And as she locked up for the night, she realized that Barron Trump's visits, however sporadic, had left an imprint on the diner and on her life in ways she hadn't expected. The warm days of summer drifted on, and though Barron didn't return immediately, Jessica found herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit. It wasn't in the way one might pine for someone. It was quieter than that. More like the absence of a familiar tune or the sudden stillness after a long, pleasant conversation. The diner continued as usual, bustling with regulars and new faces. Charlie often teased Jessica, saying she seemed distracted. Maybe she was, but as she stood by the window during her breaks, sipping coffee and watching the streetlights flicker on in the evenings, she wondered if Barron would show up again before fall. It was a late September afternoon when the doorbell jingled, and Jessica looked up from behind the counter. For a second, her heart skipped, but it wasn't him. Instead, a man she didn't recognize stepped inside, tall and well-dressed, though not overly flashy. He had the same quiet confidence Barron carried, and for a moment, she thought they might be related. Jessica, the man asked, approaching the counter with a polite nod. She frowned slightly, setting down the glass she had been cleaning. That's me. Can I help you? The man smiled faintly. I'm a friend of Barron's. He asked me to stop by. Jessica's brows shot up. Oh, is everything all right? The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He placed it on the counter gently, tapping it twice with his fingers. He wanted you to have this. Jessica wiped her hands on a dish towel and picked up the envelope carefully, feeling the weight of it. There was something about receiving it this way, through a messenger, that made her chest tighten with curiosity and concern. Is he okay? She asked, unable to stop herself. The man nodded. He's fine. Just tied up with family things right now, but he didn't forget. Jessica's lips parted slightly, but before she could say more, the man smiled and headed for the door. Take care, he said over his shoulder. And then he was gone, leaving only the soft rustling of the envelope in Jessica's hands. She slipped into the back room, away from the other customers, and carefully peeled it open. Inside was a single handwritten note on plain stationery. Jessica, life moves fast sometimes, but I wanted to thank you for making that little corner booth feel like home, even if just for a while. I'll be back when things settle down. Until then, take care of yourself. Barron. Jessica smiled softly as she read the words, the weight of them settling into her heart. She folded the note carefully, tucking it alongside the others in her locker. Maybe Barron would return in a week, or maybe not for months. But the thought didn't bother her as much as she expected. Because sometimes the quietest connections were the ones that stayed with you the longest. And in this little diner on the corner of Maple Street, Jessica knew she'd always save that booth by the window, just in case. The days began to shorten as autumn set in, and the diner settled into its familiar rhythm. The leaves outside turned brilliant shades of orange and gold, swirling gently along the sidewalks. Jessica found comfort in the seasonal shift, but part of her couldn't shake the quiet anticipation that lingered in the back of her mind. The note Barron had sent remained in her locker, tucked away like a keepsake. Every now and then, she glanced at it during her breaks, her thumb brushing lightly over the words. There was no explanation for why it meant so much, but it did. One chilly evening in late October, Jessica was wiping down tables after a slower-than-usual shift. The wind howled outside, rattling the diner's windows as the last of the customers trickled out. Charlie had left early, trusting her to lock up. leaving Jessica alone with the hum of the jukebox playing softly in the corner. The bell above the door jingled, and she instinctively glanced up, expecting to see a late-night regular. Instead, Barron stepped inside, brushing stray leaves off his coat. Jessica froze for half a second, then caught herself, quickly smoothing her apron and trying not to look too surprised. "Look who decided to show up," she teased, masking the small swell of relief that bloomed in her chest. Barron grinned, the same calm expression she remembered. "I told you I'd be back." "You sure took your time," she replied, motioning to the empty diner. "I almost started charging rent for your booth." He chuckled as he slid into his usual seat by the window. "I guess I owe you then. Cheeseburger and fries." Jessica grabbed her notepad, but the gesture was more habit than necessity. "Let me guess, coffee too." "You know me too well," Barron said, resting his hands on the table. As she placed his order in the kitchen, Jessica couldn't help but smile to herself. There was something grounding about his return, as if things had shifted back into balance. When she returned with his food, she hesitated for a moment before sitting across from him in the empty booth. "You really didn't have to send someone with that letter," she said, resting her elbows on the table. Barron shrugged, dipping a fry into ketchup. "I wanted to. I wasn't sure when I'd be able to come back, but I didn't want you to think I forgot." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "I didn't think you'd forget. You're not as mysterious as you think, you know." Barron smirked but didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced out the window, watching the way the streetlights flickered across the pavement. "It's easy to get caught up in things," he admitted after a pause. "But this place, it feels real. I needed that." Jessica's chest tightened at his words. She had always thought of the diner as just for workplace, a spot people drifted through on their way to somewhere else. But hearing Barron say it felt like home reminded her that even the smallest places could leave lasting marks. "Well," she said softly, "I'm glad you found your way back." Barron's gaze returned to hers, and for a moment, the world outside the diner faded. As the wind howled and leaves danced outside, the two of them sat quietly, the warmth of the diner filling the space between them. Jessica didn't know how long Barron would stay this time, but she knew one thing for certain: no matter how far he drifted, that little booth by the window would always be waiting for him. The wind carried the scent of autumn through the cracks of the old diner door, rattling it gently as Barron sat across from Jessica. The coffee in his cup swirled lazily, steam rising in delicate tendrils. There was a comforting stillness in the moment, the kind that settled between familiar faces who didn't need to fill the air with constant words. Jessica rested her chin in her hand, watching Barron with quiet curiosity. "So, Florida, how was it?" she asked, breaking the silence softly. Barron stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid as if searching for an answer in its depths. "Warm, quiet. Family's good," he replied simply. "It's always nice to be with them, but," he trailed off, letting the words hang between them. Jessica tilted her head, her gaze never wavering. "But it doesn't feel like home." Barron's lips pressed into a thin line, and he nodded slightly. "Not in the same way." She smiled faintly. "Well, you know where to find it, or at least a good cheeseburger and cup of coffee." His laughter came softly, barely more than a breath, but it lit up his face in a way Jessica hadn't seen before. "Yeah, I do." The jukebox in the corner crackled to life, shifting songs to something older, a tune Jessica's father used to hum when he visited the diner. It played softly, underscoring the gentle rhythm of conversation and the clinking of Barron's fork against his plate. "Can I ask you something?" Barron said after a while, his voice calm but deliberate. "Sure," Jessica replied, leaning back against the booth. "Do you ever feel stuck?" he asked, meeting her eyes with a rare sense of vulnerability. "Like this is where you're supposed to be for now, but not forever." Jessica exhaled slowly, folding her arms across her chest. "Every day." Barron looked at her curiously, waiting for her to explain. "This diner, it's comfortable, it pays the bills, but I always thought I'd do something else. Travel maybe, or go back to school," she said, glancing out the window as headlights passed by. "I guess part of me is waiting for the right moment to move forward, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just scared to let go of the familiar." Barron nodded thoughtfully, his hands resting on the table. I get that, he admitted. Sometimes, even when you have all the opportunities in the world, it feels easier to stay where things make sense. Jessica offered him a small, knowing smile. Guess we're more alike than I thought. He smirked. Guess so. The night wore on, and eventually, Barron's plate was empty, and his coffee cup sat drained beside it. Jessica refilled it without asking, and he didn't protest. By the time the diner was ready to close, Barron lingered by the door, adjusting his coat as Jessica wiped down the counter for the final time that evening. See you around? He asked, his hand resting on the door handle. Jessica smiled. I'll be here, same booth waiting for you. Barron paused, his expression softening. Thanks, Jess, for everything. She watched him disappear into the cold night, his figure fading beneath the flickering glow of streetlights. And as she locked up the diner, Jessica knew she wouldn't forget this night, or the quiet connections that somehow made the world feel just a little smaller. The season shifted once again, and as winter's chill crept back into the city, Jessica found herself reflecting on the past year. The diner had remained much the same. Same booths, same jukebox humming softly in the corner, but something felt different. Maybe it was the absence she'd grown used to, or the way certain memories lingered like echoes long after the moment had passed. Barron hadn't returned in months. Jessica wondered if he'd gotten caught up in life elsewhere, Florida, maybe, or somewhere quieter where his name didn't carry the weight it did here. She told herself not to think too much about it. People came and went. That was the nature of this place. But even as she repeated that thought, the small collection of notes he'd left behind remained carefully tucked away in her locker. Sometimes, when the diner was empty, she'd pull them out, letting the familiar words remind her of the strange, fleeting connection they'd shared. One evening, just as the first snow began to fall, Jessica was wiping down the counter after closing. The world outside felt calm, blanketed in white, and for the first time in a while, the diner felt oddly still. She flipped the sign on the door to closed and began turning off the lights, ready to head home. But as she reached for her coat, the faint jingle of the diner bell made her pause. Her heart skipped. Sorry, we're actually closed. Jessica's words trailed off as she saw who it was. Barron stood in the doorway, brushing snow from his coat, the faintest smile playing at his lips. Guess I missed closing time, he said, his eyes warm and familiar. Jessica chuckled, shaking her head as she walked back toward the counter. For you, I think I can make an exception. He slid into his usual booth, just like he had months before, as if no time had passed at all. Coffee? She asked, already reaching for the pot. Always. Jessica poured his cup and set it in front of him, resting her arms on the counter as she leaned forward. I thought you forgot about this place, she teased lightly. Barron's gaze met hers, a flicker of sincerity in his expression. I didn't forget. I just needed some time. She nodded, understanding more than she let on. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the diner's soft lighting casting shadows against the frosted windows. The snow outside thickened, but neither of them seemed in any rush to leave. After a while, Barron reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded note on the counter. Jessica raised an eyebrow. Another one for the collection. He smirked. Something like that. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she tucked it into her apron, saving it for later, knowing, somehow, that whatever it said wasn't meant to be read in the middle of a quiet diner. As Barron finished his coffee and stood to leave, Jessica followed him to the door, holding it open as the snow continued to fall around them. You'll be back, right? She asked softly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Barron paused, glancing over his shoulder with a soft smile. Yeah, I'll be back. And as he disappeared into the night once more, Jessica felt the warmth of the note tucked safely in her pocket, a quiet reminder that even the briefest encounters could leave lasting marks. The diner remained the same, but somehow she knew things had shifted in the best possible way.